If you wouldn't mind saying your name and if you're with an organization, just letting us know what that is, but just really eat that microphone.
Right, you asked, you got it. My name is Mary Silverberg. I am on the board of Connecticut for the National Federation of the Blind. I am also legally blind myself. I'm also co-chair of West Hartford's Disabilities Commission. So, one of the things I would like to comment, let's see, from Jackie and Art.
Art will be with you in just 1 sec. He had to run to grab a call.
Okay, and Eric, I would love it for you to address this. Where's Eric?
Go. He's
there
right
you
there.
are. As a blind pedestrian, and also as someone who uses all of those things mentioned, plus a couple more, different types of transportation, including paratransit. One of the things that concerns me is that I know at least for the last 5 years we have worked through all of the agencies who serve the blind and visually impaired. Lobbying in Washington, we've done it at the state and federal level, worked with the car manufacturers to have an audible signal on these vehicles. And as long as it's a consistent, standardized sound that whether it's an electric, a hybrid, whatever the vehicle is, we're good because you know what that is. I know when I hear a siren what that means. But if the auto companies are not willing to make an in-category or in-class sound that's standardized, and if they give people the choice of sounds, as I'm reading about, much like what we have choices for ringtones on our phones, well, if I don't know if I'm hearing a tweet, a horn, a beep, whatever, I don't know what to expect. I don't know what that means. And as a pedestrian crossing a street or walking on a sidewalk, now with an autonomous vehicle sharing the sidewalk with me in certain cities, this to me is a real danger. So I'd like to know how the industry is addressing that, the audible signals. Thank you.
Great, thank you. That's an excellent question.
So I'll start off and try and give you a little bit of my thoughts on that. I agree that with the autonomous vehicles and what most people may not know is that all of these vehicles being developed are electric vehicles. There's very few that are internal combustion. So these vehicles are super quiet. You don't hear them coming. I know there are a couple manufacturers that are starting to build in the sound into the car, but this is a major issue that we're facing with this revolution we're seeing with automobiles, is that the government control and oversight is not necessarily there. The technology has kind of outpaced the laws and regulations that we have on board. Unfortunately, I don't know what the answer is in terms of I think the idea of a standardized sound for these vehicles is a great idea, so that you know exactly what's coming, what direction it's coming from, and you know what that vehicle is as it's coming at you.
And I just want to say also, as AAA, that is something that I will take to our folks at the national level who are engaged in, lobbying and policy making, and it's likely something that they're already aware of, but I will make sure that they get that message as being a, priority concern.
Yeah, and I was at Consumer Reports has a test track here in Connecticut, and I was at the Consumer Reports track, a few months ago, and they had one of their electric vehicles that had that hum to it that was added in. It's basically a speaker inside the car that produces an engine noise so that you can hear that the car is coming. So I know that there are companies that are pushing that out, but I agree with you that there is no standardization in terms of what that sound actually is, what frequency it is that audible to certain hearing ranges, what type of pitch and tone it is. There's a whole lot of research that probably needs to go into that area to determine exactly which is the most audible sound, which is a sound that produces, the ability for people to be able to hear that car coming. And
as you're talking about an aging population, once you get beyond 4,000 hertz, conversational 1,000 to 400 hertz, 4,000 hertz, excuse me, it changes, and older people are not going to hear it if it's a high-pitched squeak. So
all things important
all of those things
to take into consideration.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. If anyone else has a question, just raise your hand, and Tara will be sure to bring the microphone. Your name and, again, the microphone.
It's on now, right? Hi, my name's Rod Ferguson. I work for Connecticut Sun Nerd Solar Brokers. Just a general concern I have about automation. In Connecticut, we're talking about tolls. I just went to Brazil, and here in the Hartford market, we have a choice of flying from Bradley and paying roughly twice as much money as flying out of New York. So then you got to deal with driving to New York. So as I returned, I get a picture of our car going through the toll over the bridge, and it's like 2 weeks later, and they have a late fee on there already. So the toll was about $8, and it turned out to be about $40 with all the fees. So I question if this is going to happen in Connecticut, if we put in these tolls, if they're going to have these cameras versus having real folk, real humans. Thank you.
I think that's a little bit out of the scope of this
That's right.
event.
We would need several more hours to address the toll issue this morning. But, you know, what I think is important, I'll just touch briefly on that, is that there has been a lot of discussion that the whole tolls issue has raised, and there's been an opportunity to be heard. So I would say, you know, to continue to raise your voice and your concerns, and hopefully that's something that the administration will take into consideration.
Just one point along those lines of tolls. One of the reasons that tolls are becoming necessary is because cars are becoming more energy efficient. And if we move to an electronic fleet where electric vehicles are there, you no longer have the revenue coming from the gas tax. So basically anybody that's driving an electric car is no longer paying for the roads that they drive on. So moving away from a gas tax model to more of a pay per mile or pay per use is the way that the DOT is going to have to move in order to maintain the roadways that are out there.
And hopefully that money will go towards people like Dennis and his team at the DOT and all those exciting things that he was outlining for us. Tara and Mr. Maloney.
My name's Kevin Maloney, and I served on the Connecticut Public Transportation Commission for about a decade. Just one quick comment and a couple of questions, if you'll indulge me. In Connecticut, we have a rapidly aging demographic. And when we held public hearings, one of the common threads in all the hearings was the demand for an increased public transportation, because they recognized they were going to, for various reasons, going to be unable to drive themselves. I suspect that's why Commissioner Porter's here, because while I think Lyft and Uber have mitigated that demand somewhat, the prospect of an autonomous vehicle that someone could depend on, particularly a paratransit autonomous vehicle, would provide the freedom of mobility that I think under other circumstances would be virtually impossible. So that's probably the greatest advantage to this technology. Two quick questions. Dennis, you talked about platooning buses. Would that involve one driver or two drivers?
One.
One driver.
The second one just drafts from the first, and it obviously operates with a lot less power, and it's completely controlled by the bus in front of it.
And just to play the devil's advocate for a minute, what happens when all of this technology is interconnected and we suffer a cyber attack? And to give you a window into that potential, as PG&E is selectively terminating electric service to people in California, they're virtually immobilizing all these people that have EVs because they have no way to charge their vehicles. So how do we protect, which, I mean, that could be catastrophic. Think about all of the public transit and autonomous vehicles in private hands being disabled. How do we protect ourselves from that?
You know, I think that's a global issue and an issue that goes beyond public transportation. You know, the cyber issue would affect us in how we get our food, how we get, you know, how we function. So I don't know that it should prohibit us from moving forward technologically in a transportation basis, but it is certainly a national issue that needs to be addressed because it has to do with our banking, it has to do with pretty much every function that we have as a society.
And I would just say that we're going to face these issues. We had similar issues when the hurricane came through and nobody could get gasoline moving forward. So regardless of the fuel source, there's always challenges in emergency events to be able to provide power to vehicles moving forward. I would say that cybersecurity is a big issue, and I think one of the next topics that we're looking at for one of the next technology takes the wheel speeches is actually on cybersecurity. Now, obviously, that's a completely different group than maybe what people are here. It's much more technical, but I think it's another conversation that needs to take place in terms of understanding the risks that are going to come as we move to an autonomous or automated fleet.
And Jackie, I would think that these topics are things that the task force will also be addressing.
Yeah, cybersecurity is really important, particularly since it's affecting cars now. I mean, most cars have over 350 computer chips on them, and they have had some very public hacks, not just from getting entry into the vehicle, but you also can have people remotely access some of the computer controls regarding braking and speed. And the automobile manufacturers, the traditional ones, are struggling with understanding what the implications are of that. So yeah, it is top of mind for us.
Tony.
Yeah, Tony Schroels at Transport Hartford Academy at the Center for Latino Progress. I have two questions around equity. The first question is, when we talk about who is walking and biking, like the folks getting smashed to pieces in the demonstration video there, and who they are and what they're carrying in their pockets. I've heard things about the future connected vehicle networks knowing where people are because they're carrying an electronic device, or their bicycle has an electronic device. And the assumption that that exists in low-income communities is going to be flawed or 10 years behind. And that's, when we make that assumption and make it part of the plan, we're not dealing with the equity issues as who is walking and biking in large parts in our cities. And I think I'll go with the second one. So we've already seen that the state is very slow to respond with regulation and policy for things like Uber and Lyft, right? Rideshare, slightly technology-based, taxi cabs, right? And the transition of those living wage jobs to minimum wage or less than minimum wage jobs with no benefits has been a large result, as well as increased congestion in some cities. So if that's our standard for how we move behind this technology, and we typically are resulting in fewer living wage jobs, now we're talking about autonomous vehicles and removing drivers entirely. What's the equity impact of driverless vehicles for individual vehicle transit or large vehicle transit?
I'll tackle it. We talked about it in the task force about whether we were going to look at the economic impacts of autonomous technology as it would impact jobs and job opportunities. But it's a moving target. It's kind of outside the scope of what we were formed to do. And Connecticut's not the only one struggling with the issue. I think that as you look at things from the way currently people are employed and understand that when new technology gets introduced that's never been done before, new opportunities will arise. And I think that what we're seeing with the electrification of vehicles is that there are entire new job categories that now exist that are a one-to-one replacement. And I can't remember the study that I read that spoke to that, but I think that we're going to find out. It's not a very good answer, but it is the answer that we have.
Okay, next question. Go ahead.
Lee Granis, Greater Haven Clean Cities, also on the board of the Greater Haven Transit District. This is probably named more to Dennis. I heard the price tag for the upgrade of the New Haven depot, and I'm sure the others are in that same category as far as the electrification of them. What's DOT position going to be on this, how that's going to be paid for? Because it's in the millions of dollars, as you know. And if we get more and more, if we electrify the fleet across the board, we're talking about DC fast chargers that are 150 kW or so. And do you want to comment a little bit on V2G, if that's going to be a player in it?
We know what the climate issues are with our planet. We know that we need to move towards a non-fossil burning fuel source. I had an all CNG facility in Erie, Pennsylvania, compressed natural gas that I built there. The cost to make the facility capable of housing compressed natural gas buses was very significant. An explosion-proof fueling location in the building, and light fixtures that, if there was a gas leak, would not create an explosion. By negotiating, though, an all-gas facility and all-gas fleet, we were able to achieve a very low rate with the gas company. And I'm sure that the authority has reaped financial rewards cost-wise 100-fold over the cost, which was expensive, to the capital cost of making the facility CNG compliant. I can tell you that the cost of electrifying a building is significantly less than the cost of making a facility CNG compliant, but the potential financial rewards are even greater. Currently, an electric bus costs about twice that of a diesel bus, but because of the competition in the industry, those costs are rapidly decreasing. The actual number of parts in an electric vehicle is way less than the actual number of parts in a diesel vehicle, as is the maintenance cost of preventative maintenance and all the things that go into it. So the long-term cost savings of operating an all-electric fleet will far exceed the investment that we put into it, into the facilities. A capital investment in a facility, it has a 40-year useful life by the Federal Transit Administration standards, meaning that the building will be in place for 40 years. If you amortize that over a 40-year period, the actual cost on a yearly basis to have improved that facility is modest compared to the long-term cost implications from operating and maintaining the fleet, as well as the planetary issues. I mean, since we've been in the business, the number one catalyst right now for the push towards electrification is the planet's condition, right? We had technologies in the past that had we had a national crisis, may have been considered to be used. But a lot of what we're seeing legislatively, not just here in Connecticut, but nationally, is a response to global warming and all the problems that we're facing. There is a debate nationally now whether electric is the best choice or not. But truthfully, it's the best choice we have now. And we need to move forward rapidly, moving away from most traditional fossil fuels. You know that I have a interest in potentially a gas pilot. It's not something we would, natural gas pilot. That's not, or propane rather. It's not something we would necessarily not consider, even with the electrification of the fleet, because we're more than willing to look at multiple sources of fuel. And electric may not be the fuel 50 years from now. I mean, it may be hydrogen, it may be something else. But I think the pressure now to make these changes are based on a few things, to electrification, are based on a few things. Number one is the climate. Number two is the industry's push towards electric manufacturers coming into the business have never been in the business are solely producing electric buses. These are pressures that have not existed. For years we've been trying to come up with one new technology, and never have all of these facets come into play at the exact same time like we have today. You have the manufacturers, you have the climate issue, and you have the private industry pushing heavily towards electrification. Most major car companies, I think Honda the other day said in 3 years they're no longer going to produce gas vehicles. Very few of the major car manufacturers are continuing with research and development on gasoline vehicles. So you've got those three factors all lined up that are pushing the industry towards electric, and it's the only time since I've been doing this, which is longer than, again, I care to admit, that you've had consensus. And there's just consensus from the private sector, from the global issue, and from, again, the manufacturers jumping in the business and creating competition where there wasn't any, driving the cost down. When I bought my first electric bus, it took 13 years before, gas bus, it took 13 years before I bought another one. It took 13 years. When I first bought a CNG bus, it was twice the cost of a diesel bus. It took 13 years later that the cost of the CNG bus was only $40,000 more than the cost of a diesel bus, and we could go into it whole scale. Right now, a diesel bus is $450,000. A gas bus electric bus is $800,000. I think within 2 or 3 years, you'll see them at $656 and rapidly dropping. The curve is dramatic. So all of those factors together are pushing us towards electric. It really isn't us in Connecticut saying we like electric and we think it's the wave of the future. It's a national trend that we're adjusting to, and we know this is where it's going. And again, we've been legislatively mandated to do that, and I think that's pretty much consistent across the country.
Thanks, Dennis. Next question. Alex Slatke, AAA Northeast.
Hey, thanks for the introduction, Amy. My question is about kind of the low-speed shuttles that both Jackie and Art had mentioned, and I think the question's particularly for you. Just curious about your vision for those. Do you see those as kind of a means to an end, a means to test out this technology and get it out to the public, or do you see those at in airports, or you mentioned the shuttle in Las Vegas, as actually ends in themselves if we're looking 30, 35 years from now?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of testing is going on there. I'm not sure that the market that the market is really that strong. Even in Las Vegas, to be honest with you, you could probably in most cases walk as quick. They can serve as connectors. I could see a lot of them businesses. If you have a business where there's a remote parking lot, but you need to connect to a venue, they could serve those kinds of purposes. And I don't want to rule them out as a circulator type system too. Not always is walking an option. It might be rainy, or it might be too hot, or it might be a certain number of people would rather ride than walk. So but I'm not sure that I think really. They're a precursor to the bigger application, which would be on dedicated rights of way. But I don't want to rule them out altogether.
So the next question is from Jim McPherson. Jim is an automotive expert. He's a AAA driving school instructor, and he and his wife actually both only own electric vehicles. And so Jim drives a Tesla. I'm giving you a little, ladies and gentlemen, Jim McPherson.
Thank you very much, I think. For years, the federal government regulated vehicles in terms of safety while the states regulated drivers, and now we're seeing a situation in which the car becomes the driver, which creates an inevitable potential for conflict. How are we handling that in this country at the federal level, and how does our handling of this situation compare to how other countries are handling it?
I know DMV is looking at how to regulate the vehicles kind of moving forward. Kind of the licensure of a vehicle versus the licensure of a driver is definitely a topic that they're considering and looking at. I know also that a lot of the federal regulations, a lot of these vehicles have been exempt from some of the federal safety regulations, and they've put that onto the automotive manufacturers to independently verify that their vehicles are safe. There's definitely something we're looking into at UConn. Is there an independent agency that could be developed to test and verify the safety of vehicles? I don't know what other countries are doing, so I don't know the best answer for that.
So this is another example of things where it's being worked out right now because the liability of the computers that are in the current cars that are driven by people is being litigated on a state-by-state basis. I don't think under the current federal administration there's going to be a direction into federalizing some of that, but I think that as more technology is taking over the control of vehicles and their attributes, that it will need to be regulated in some way from a national standpoint. We don't want to have a country of 50 different standards that vehicles would have to meet from any aspect from that standpoint. I would also add that it is the insurance industry and the actuaries that are working directly with vehicle manufacturers on reducing liability issues for vehicles overall. So I think that is where the push is that's happening.
Yeah, I'd also say that as you potentially or probably know, you can get a vehicle update overnight, and now your vehicle has new features that it did not have the day before, and being able to control and regulate those options is going to be a very difficult task moving forward.
Great. I think what we'll do is we'll take one more question, and then we have the opportunity for a little networking and to have some of your questions answered. We have some cookies and refreshments in a room just outside of this room. So if we could just have one more question, and then we'll move to that room.
Thank you, Amy. Tim Healy, American Society of Safety Engineers, Transportation Practice Specialty. Mostly for Eric. Tag along to what the good Mr. McPherson just talked about, changing the driver's environment. We started right off with the idea that we want to eliminate the drivers. It's going to be a long time before that happens by everybody's admission. What are we going to do to improve the type of driver training that our drivers have to have now as we meet a mix of level 0 to level 3 cars, and that mix is going to get worse as time goes on. What are we going to do for new drivers? What are we going to do to make existing drivers be able to work compatibly on our public roads with all of those changes going on?
So I want to say first that I think that that's a great question, because that's really something that AAA is up against. In terms of, I know we have some driving instructors, AAA driving instructors here, but we've already started to see that, the AAA messaging we may have to add to our messaging, not just about keeping your eyes on the road, but keeping your hands on the wheel. If what we've seen in terms of Tesla and people becoming almost too comfortable with the technology before it's fully ready, and we've already had a number of fatal crashes as a result of that. So certainly from a AAA perspective, we will constantly be improving our public education and our driver education to address, the changes that you describe.
Yeah, I mean, this is an extremely challenging thing to try and do. So there's been several proposed models. One is looking at dealerships to provide this type of training, and that's not going to work, because most people don't want to spend a minute longer in the dealership than they have to. They want to get their car and they want to get out there. If you've purchased a car recently, I've driven off the lot not knowing what any of the lights on my dash actually do, not knowing what any of these buzzers or sounds actually do. I've got things flashing at me all over the place and I have no clue what's going on. It's a major education issue.
And what happens is people end up turning some of these systems off, and these are safety systems. So that's a problem unto itself.
Right, so I mean, that's one of the goals of this Technology Takes the Wheel effort, is to start educating the public on what is coming and what is out there. If you have ideas on how to get this out to a broader audience, we're more than willing to try and figure out a way to make this more massively available to people. But the driver education piece is going to be a huge part moving forward, so that people understand what these vehicles are, what they can, and most likely what they can't do, and what they're kind of over-promising. And there's no standardization right now in terms of what they're calling the features within the car. So one car calls it autopilot, one calls it ProPilot Assist, another one calls it something completely different, and they are, in reality, completely different.
Or they all call it the same thing, but the systems are actually different, like we've seen with the automatic emergency braking.
Exactly. So, I mean, we're looking at really an unregulated system moving forward, and the government's kind of stepped back and said, we're going to let the market play this out. I don't know that it's the right decision. I don't know that it's the wrong decision, but it's a decision that we have, and it's the reality we have to work in, and we have to find a way to educate the public to be safe in their vehicles.
And from AAA's perspective, also, when we started with Technology Takes the Wheel, just a couple years ago, everyone was predicting that the fully autonomous vehicles were just a few years away. And now that prediction, people have really backed off that. And so what you see is this long period of time with a potentially mixed fleet of different levels of autonomy or no autonomy whatsoever. And there's a lot of potential for danger, as you point out there. So the Technology Takes the Wheel. Initially we were talking about self-driving vehicles, but now we're really trying to make the focus on this transition period that we are going to go through for the next several years. Yes. So with that, I think I am going to thank everyone for their attendance. First, thanks to UConn for their partnership for this program. Thanks so much to our speakers for the time and energy you put in before you got here today, and then the expertise that you brought to the table and that you were able to share with our audience here in Connecticut. We really appreciate it. A lot of exciting things happening. I don't want to end on a negative or frightening note, Dennis. So I really am excited about what's going on at the DOT, and I hope you will bring your questions to the room with the cookies. And again, thank you to Commissioner Porter, and I hope there is a lot of opportunity and optimism within your agency based on what you heard here today. And I know from AAA's perspective, if we can help in any way, we're certainly here to do that. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.